So let me describe to you what we are doing, a little bit about how it came about, why we think it's necessary, and what we think it might accomplish with enough effort and support and a lot of trying hard and a little bit of luck. So all of this has to do with an idea that everybody who works on the researching the brain has in common, which is we all consider it to be the last frontier. And I think probably a lot of people would say that that's a reasonable way of describing it. And it's an enormous challenge. The brain is without question the most complicated thing that we have as part of our bodies, our most complex organ, the one that is the most intricate, and in some respects, the one that we have so far been able to see and understand the least about, for all that we have figured out about it, which is really quite a lot over the past 50 and 100 years. If you compare it to other aspects of the human body, then you have to say that we still are far from understanding it. And if you contrast it with things like the heart and cardiology, which is now a very advanced science and medicine with a great deal of understanding and a huge array of treatments and options that are available to deal with many, many different problems that are associated with the heart. You can see that as far as the brain is concerned, we're actually very far behind that. So it was with these two ideas in mind, the idea that it's the last frontier and a tremendous challenge to understand, and also that there are very serious problems, injuries, and illnesses associated with it that we still are far from being able to deal with effectively, that several of us scientists who were at a meeting back in 2011 came up with what seemed like a little bit of a wild idea, which is that maybe we could get some support to start the effort to make the new technologies that would allow us to see and understand better what is going on in the brain. And this was a meeting of neuroscientists, people who work on the brain, and engineers and physicists who work on tiny, tiny little materials, and they're called nanoscientists. And out of this came 6 of us who were gung-ho on this. Most of the rest of them thought we were kind of crazy. But the 6 of us put together a plan, and the meeting organizer, who knew somebody in the White House Office of Science and Technology, sent him the plan, and he liked it. And over the course of the next year and a half, they kept getting more and more interested in it. And the way that we found out that they decided that it would be one of their new grand challenges for the country was during the State of the Union address in 2013, when the president talked about it. And he quoted part of our report and said, and briefly talked about what we were going to do, and talked about it in the context of how important it was to invest in science. So out of that came what's called the BRAIN Initiative, a federal program to support research to develop these new technologies. And this started a whole series of other momentum events, so that the California legislature got interested in it, because this seemed a lot like a California thing. It had innovation, it had science, and it had new technology. And California has been at the forefront of a lot of that. And so it was with that idea that the person who was then Senate Majority Leader in California, Ellen Corbett, contacted us down here, and that started a series of events that produced a California program called CalBrain that the legislature and governor approved last year and just completed its first year of operation, again, supporting research into these new technologies. So not to stop there, we think, okay, we did federal, then we did state, we need to do local. So we talked about putting together a San Diego consortium. Because if California is really good at innovation and collaboration and science, we know that San Diego is even better than the rest of California in all of those things. So we thought, well, let's have a regional coalition as well. And so we got all of these institutions together to agree to participate in this. And we got a generous grant to start the project from the Legler-Benbow Foundation. Peter Ellsworth is here in the audience today. And so with all of these things underway to foster this new research, help support getting projects started, and in the case of this regional area, also start a new training program in this and help create the new generation of scientists, physicians, and engineers who will work in this new area. We are launched, and we think that this really has possibilities, and what we want to do today is to give you an idea, as far as we know at the moment, because we're still very much at the beginning of where we are and where this might go. Why do we need this? Well, most of the things that are serious that go wrong with the brain are really, really tough to deal with. And that's true of psychiatric disease, it's true of the degenerative disease, it's true of brain injury, it's true of many, many aspects of what goes wrong with the brain. And what people who work on these things have begun to realize more and more is that these are very broadly affecting the brain, not just necessarily happening in one little place. They're not all everywhere, but mostly they're not terribly local either. And so that is part of the reason why having the ability to see broadly what's going on in the brain is so important, and why we thought of this idea that we refer to as making the brain activity map. That is, understanding what are the lines of communication in the brain that make all of the things happen that we experience minute to minute, what parts of the brain are talking to what other parts, and how are they communicating, and how does that produce our experience, and how does it go wrong in all of these various disorders and injuries and so on that produce the kinds of problems that have to do with memory and mood and perception and control of movement and all of these different things. So in a sense, we know what the symptoms are in these things, and we know a little bit where we can see something obviously abnormal in the brain, but nobody can give a very coherent explanation of why it's really not working because of that limitation in our understanding of it. So, why should society care about this, aside from all of the people who have to deal with it in every day of their lives? Why should society care? Well, because in fact, things that go wrong with the brain, if you add them all together, are much more of a burden on society than any other disease area. It outstrips cardiology, it outstrips diabetes, and so on. This is something that the director of the National Institutes of Mental Health, Tom Insel, is always going around and reminding people. And that's not very well appreciated. They're a tremendous challenge for drug development. And of course, all drugs have difficulty in the sense of how much can they have an effect without having harmful side effects. All drugs have some degree of side effect. The ones that are used for brain disorders seem to be very outstanding in having many, many side effects. And part of the reason for that has to do with what we do know about how the brain works, which is that you can't make a drug only go to one little part of the brain. It goes everywhere, and the brain is talking back and forth all over the place, and the things that the drug interacts with are not necessarily only in one place. So you will always be in danger of getting much broader effects than you want, many of which will not be at all what you want. How do we deal with that? And the pharmaceutical industry has struggled with this. Even in the work on Alzheimer's, which is the largest effort that they put into it, most of their efforts have not succeeded. Drugs for psychiatric disease have been so much worse in their success rate that they're even retreating from trying anymore. And most of these just treat symptoms, which is limited for how effective it can be. And if you, the reason then why we need the new technologies come about when you see how little progress has been made in 50 years in studying brain disorders as opposed to something like cardiology. Somewhere here I have a pointer, I think. Is that my pointer? If you look at the bars on the left side for the 1950s, that shows you sort of the number of different, what they refer to as drug targets, meaning what are the kinds of mechanisms that drugs have been found that are known that drugs can be developed against. And then on the right, if you look at what has happened since then, there's been a huge explosion in cardiology and not much improvement in the brain. And what kinds of additional therapies are there besides drugs? Well, for certain disorders, notably Parkinson's, you can actually stimulate particular parts of the brain and alleviate symptoms, and this can have some beneficial effect. It's usually used for people for whom the drugs no longer have any effectiveness, but it's a very disruptive technique in the sense that it involves implanting electrodes through the head and deep into the brain. There are also other kinds of electrodes that are on the surface of the brain that have been starting to be used successfully to drive something like a prosthetic limb for people who are paralyzed. This has great promise. It's still in its very, very early stages, but it does show that the potential is there, that if you can do some kind of a very targeted stimulation of the right part of the brain, if you can figure out which part of the brain you need to stimulate and how to stimulate it, you can actually begin to counteract or compensate for certain of the deficits associated with brain disorders. These are very early steps and they're rather limited, but they may indicate some possible directions. So what is it that needs to be overcome in understanding this? Well, most of neuroscience has been effective understanding things that happen in a single nerve cell because we can study them in great detail and depth. We can see exactly what their electrical activities are by putting an electrode into it and recording those electrical activities. We can isolate them and understand what the chemicals are that they have in them, what genes have been active in them, and what proteins are being made, and where they go in the cell, and an enormous amount about how they do all that. So we're really, really good at the cellular and molecular level. At the level of the whole brain, we're more limited. We have a couple of imaging techniques. The most commonly used one is on the right there. It's called MRI. And you can see some aspect of the activity of the brain, which is what those colored regions indicate from a study that was done. And what they're telling you are which parts of the brain have received a greater amount of blood flow associated with whatever that person was doing at the time that that recording was made. So they put people into the MRI machine, which many of you may have had the experience of being loaded into, and they can have them read something, they can have them listen to a recording of something, they can have them do a certain amount of movement of their hands to see what that does, and then they'll ask what parts of the brain start to get more blood flow as a result of it, and that's telling you kind of in a slow accumulation of activity which parts might have been more active than which other parts. But it's missing all of the things that are happening at the split-second level and all of the things that happen in your brain that you experience in your moment-to-moment life are happening at a time scale that is unimaginably fast. Think of how long it takes you to recognize somebody when they walk in the room. That is literally milliseconds, or hundreds of milliseconds maybe, but pretty fast. You can't record that in any of our techniques that show you the whole brain like this. There are also techniques like EEG, or electroencephalography, where you have electrodes that are placed on the scalp and that they kind of pick up a general signature of the sum of all the electrical activities that get that far to make it out of the skull, which are weak and which are not very localized. And that happens at a split-second level, but it gives you no picture of the brain because it's just kind of everything being added together. So that's the challenge. How do you get from this exquisite single-cell level up to that comprehensive level? And that's really what our goal is. How can we do this? So let me go ahead here a little bit. I'll skip over the importance of technology initiatives just to say that when they've been done in the past, they've given rise to lots of new technologies, but I don't want to spend the time on that. Let me tell you at least a taste of what are the sorts of things that people are working on now that we think have potential for creating whole new ways of seeing into and understanding the brain and producing this brain activity map. So people are working on different kinds of sensors that would be incredibly small and non-disruptive, and that can pick up things like electrical activity and chemical activity. People are also working, these are scientists here at our research institutions, also working on incredibly tiny little wireless devices that can send and receive and record and send out signals that they've recorded. Some of these are so tiny and so integrated, possibly, that they could even run off of the electrical activity that's in the brain rather than needing a power source, which is an amazing sort of idea. None of these are anywhere close to being tried out yet in human subjects, not even yet in animal subjects, but they're ideas that are being tried. Because you have to dig deep. If you want to see real breakthroughs, you can't just try to go to the next easiest step that there is. You have to go for something that's really going to be different, and that means trying a lot of different sorts of ideas. And there's a great quote from Albert Einstein that Danny found that she put in the inside front page of your program that embodies this idea very well, that you have to be, I forget the exact wording of it, but the notion is you have to be more hopeful and excited about what you might find than afraid of not getting there. So similarly, people are trying new sorts of physical approaches towards imaging, seeing whether ultrasound can be done at a high resolution level. There's some who are interested in trying to pick up the tiny little temperature changes associated with brain activity. And then in the shorter term, the more immediate kinds of things have to do with being able to improve the effectiveness of prosthetic devices for not just limb movement for people who have restricted limb movement, but there are efforts to make things that could actually be memory prostheses when there have been memory deficits. Something that would be an external device that would interact with the electrical activity that you can record initially on the surface of the head, so it wouldn't be disruptive inside, and that could actually augment memory. This is a very interesting idea. It's feasible enough that people are really trying it out now. Again, not on people yet, but experimental animals. And in addition, then, there are efforts to make new tracers for how you would detect activity in MRI, in current techniques, either MRI or PET scanning, another imaging technique for the brain that can look at specific chemicals. And out of these have already come some interesting new possibilities for early diagnosis. That's going to be the first thing that we'll get out of this, is more detailed, sensitive, and earlier diagnosis of everything. And one of these tracers picks up brain inflammation, which means that one could tell right off the bat if an accident that produced a brain injury had done so without waiting for the period of time it takes for the full symptoms to develop. Similarly, there are tracers for looking at the wholesale patterns of gene activity in the brain, which could prove to be a real signature for many, many of these different brain disorders and diseases. So there are things in the works, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for this. The idea that we're going to have a new training program and have students who are postdoctoral trainees, graduate student trainees, and even undergraduates eventually, is already starting to happen at those more advanced levels. And this has produced a tremendous amount of enthusiasm among the students in these areas, because they see that there are real possibilities here, and they want to be involved in this. And one of the most gratifying things about it has been seeing how enthusiastic the engineering community is to team up with neuroscientists. And so we've been able to start a whole series of new collaborations here at UCSD and in the region to make that really work. So if this can be sufficiently well supported, there can be real advances that are made in these areas. And some of them will be short-term, and the more dramatic ones will take a bit longer. But we know that it can happen, because the history of these initiatives, as I was describing to you briefly, is that when you make a push for new technology, as in the case of the moonshot, as in the case of the war on cancer, and as in the case of the Genome Project, in all of those cases, new things came out that were completely unanticipated and that were revolutionary. The moonshot produced microelectronics, which is a fairly important part of our daily lives now. The war on cancer produced the biotechnology industry. Completely didn't exist before that. And that was where the funding came from that made the breakthroughs that allowed that industry to form. The Genome Project produced a whole industry of DNA sequencing that nobody ever anticipated. So I'm sure that the efforts that we're involved in will also give us some great new surprises, and we hope will help us solve some of these very difficult problems. So I think I've used up my time.